first went into the library, I read anything that the librarian directed me to. However, at a particular point, I became very interested in biographies. It would be about anybody: Booker T. Washington, David Crockett, Patrick Henry, George Washington. It just didn't matter. Probably very ordinary in terms of their upbringing, but then would go on to become these extraordinary individuals. I was very interested in what their process was. Yeah, well, when I was in high school, and I used to go to my counselor's office and just look at all of the catalogs, college catalogs. I glanced at practically all of them. And I looked at the University of Virginia, and it looked as if everybody there was a white male, and he was wearing a suit. Uh-huh. So I knew that I didn't really want to go there. But that was even changing. The dress code was gotten rid of just before I got there. Mm-hmm. It was also that era of the late 60s and early 70s, which I think a more liberal attitude was coming onto the campus than had been there previously. So I came at just the right time. Mm-hmm. So I enjoyed the experience. But there were others who thought that there was not enough black culture and would transfer it to historically black schools, mm-hmm. or just leave, or because of the social element would get a little bit depressed. But I sort of enjoyed the isolation that you're allowed on a large campus, one that's so large that you can get lost and pretty much do what you want to do. I was an English major at the University of Virginia. I have picked out James Wendell Johnson's The Creation, a sermon in verse that he wrote published in 1927 in a collection that he called God's Trombones. But in order to recite that particular poem, I do need to also give some introductory material. I'm sure you will be familiar with the mountaintop sermon that Martin Luther King Jr. gave on April the 3rd, 1968. I've been to the mountaintop, and I've been allowed to look over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the promised land. And so that's why tonight I'm not afraid of anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. King gave that speech in 1968, but James Wendell Johnson, who was born in the 1870s, would have been quite familiar with that type of sermonic presentation. He also would have been quite familiar with the sort of spiritual that was going on at the time that he was coming along in the latter part of the 19th century. Spiritual such as, "Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me. And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." James Wendell Johnson was a very smart man, a gifted individual. And even though he had been exposed to those sorts of biblical presentations, those black presentations, he also realized that underneath it all was a certain kind of subversiveness that would not pass muster in the general mainstream population. If you look to the autobiography of an ex-colored man that he first published in 1912 and came out again during the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, you can sort of see the kind of cultural tightrope that James Wendell Johnson had to walk in terms of trying to convey the richness and power of legitimate black culture and at the same time have it accepted by the white mainstream. If you look at that, you also will see that ex-colored is the title there. So James Wendell Johnson must have been engaged in a battle within himself in terms of who he was and who African Americans in society had to be in order to survive. He himself had been a writer of what was called coon songs for Broadway in the latter part of the 19th century. Songs such as "I Got Troubles of My Own," about a Baptist deacon who is tired of listening to other people's problems. And that song goes, "This here taking me for a philanthropist is certainly got to stop. It seems to me the darkies got it in their heads that I'm a free pawn shop. Surely we'll inform 'em and inform 'em quick That friendship bank's done bust. I'm going to notify these clad-hand coons that I don't intend to run no trouble trust. That's a song that was actually written by James Wendell Johnson. But even at the same time that he was writing that particular song, he was aware that dialect would only allow the audience to have a couple of responses. One would be pathos and the other would be humor. And he felt that white America was probably very inclined and eager to see black representations in that particular form. So here you begin to see, you see the internal conflict that James Wendell Johnson is going through in terms of how to present African American culture. And this is what I believe James Wendell Johnson came up with in terms of trying to figure out how to walk that fence. The James Wendell Johnson was born in 1871. The date of the creation was 1927.
Right.
And God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. And as far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything, blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other, and God said, that's good. Then God reached out and took the light in his hands, and God rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun, and he set that sun a-blazing in the heavens. And the light that was left from making the sun, God gathered it up in a shining ball, and he flung it against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and stars. Then down between the darkness and the light, he hurled the world. And God said, that's good. Then God himself stepped down, and the sun was on his right hand, and the moon was on his left, and the stars were clustered about his head, and the earth was under his feet. And God walked, and where he trod, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. Then he stopped and looked and saw that the earth was hot and barren. So God stepped over to the edge of the world, and he spat out the 7 seas. He batted his eyes, and the lightnings flashed. He clapped his hands, and the thunders rolled, and the waters above the earth came down. The cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted, and the little red flowers blossomed. The pine tree pointed his finger to the sky, and the oak spread out his arms. The lakes cuddled down in the hollows of the ground, and the rivers ran down to the sea. And God smiled, and the rainbow appeared and curled itself around his shoulder. Then God raised his arm and waved his hand over the sea and over the land, and he said, bring forth, bring forth. And quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forests and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, that's good. And God walked around, and God looked around, and all that he had made, he looked at his sun, and he looked at his moon, and he looked at his little stars. He looked on his world with all its living things, and God said, I'm lonely still. Then God sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river he sat down. With his head in his hands, God thought and thought and thought, till he thought, I'll make me a man. Up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river, he kneeled him down, and there the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the far corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hand, this great God, like a mammy, bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay, till he shaped it in his own image. Then into it he blew the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen. Amen.
That's really good. So why'd you pick that one?
I jumped to the conclusion that this one would be a good one to use because, to be quite frank with you, my aunt used to come down when I was a little boy and recite it to me. And she had committed it to memory, so I thought she made it up herself. And she used to recite all kinds of stories and rhymes. She was my favorite aunt, and she was a really jovial sort of person. We lived in a really small apartment on one side of town, and she would catch the train down from Philadelphia. She had migrated up to Wilmington, Delaware, and she would go to the Philadelphia train and come down to Richmond, Virginia, I think just to check on me. And so this woman would get off of the train in Richmond, walk from the train station in the snow, and my mother had told me don't open the door for anybody when she wasn't there, but I could hear her outside the door, so I would hear this knocking, and I would run to the door, and you'd see this woman. She must have been in the 30s or 40s back then. She's kicking off her boots from where she'd walked through the snow to come to the bad side of town. A woman could do that in those days, in the late 50s and early 1960s. And it was sort of understood that you didn't attack women as they were about their various tasks. So she would come and she would spend half the night. I used to have to be in bed by 8 or 9 o'clock usually, but when she came to town, I was allowed to stay up pretty late. And this was one of the poems that she would recite to me. And she recited it with such power and emphasis in just the right places that it stayed with me all the time. Well, if you notice, that is why I brought in Martin Luther King, his use of biblical imagery, the use of metaphors, actually the way it's presented, even like an old-time Southern Baptist preacher. I think that has an awful lot to do with black literature. You can see that actually converted into the novel form. I think someone like Zoe Neale Hurston, whose father was a minister, is many times using the sermonic form to get across her point. In particular, when you get to a novel like Jonas Goldvine, you actually see the sermon itself. Well, I think Ralph Ellison was aware that it's going to be very difficult to tell, because there's such cultural crossover between the races, to tell exactly what specific forms were converted in order to make our mainstream culture. But he did believe that if it were not for African Americans, we would not have the American culture that we do indeed now have. If you look to things like work songs, field hollers, spirituals, blues, if you look at it in their raw form, I think many of them mainstream culture would not be able to stomach. I mean, it really does express the tears, the regrets, the tragedy of the African American experience, not too far removed from slavery. So when you have literary figures coming along like James Wendell Johnson, as I had indicated, they do indeed have to figure out a way to convert it into a form that's going to be more palatable, not as subversive. You can even look at someone like a B.B. King and see how he's converted an original blues form into something that's more palatable for mainstream culture. So I believe it's going on all the time. By the time you get to the end of the autobiography of Next Colored Man, that's what you got the narrator saying, in terms of having done various things, like wondered whether or not I could convert true black culture to a more acceptable form, actually concluding by the end of the novel that I'll just become white. But at the end of the day, you have to ask yourself whether a person who conducts that particular transformation with culture, whether or not they have indeed, as James Wendell Johnson indicated at the end of his novel, have they sold their soul for a mess of pottage? In other words, for money. To see what institutions are doing now with regard to diversity, I often have to ask myself the question whether or not institutions have really become interested in diversity, whether they have gone beyond the point of thinking of blacks as just a little bit less, a little bit inferior. Have they gone beyond that to the point where they really believe that African Americans, let me finish, are equal, or is it some sort of political ploy that's in act now?
Sure.
Well, like I said, I'm still sort of hashing
You're
it out
still working
myself.
on it, yeah.
I think of the phrase political correctness.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm wondering whether whites in top administrative positions are really interested in the best interest of African Americans in this country,
Mm-hmm.
or are they more interested in something else? And in terms of what that something else is, I'm not sure. How do you know which white person really is on the up and up? How do you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because at that particular point, you all were all saying we're on the up and up. We
Right.
all like you. We all want what's best for you, and we knew that that was not true. So how do you tell the difference? And at the same time, there are many who are making sacrifices and really are concerned about the betterment of African Americans. And I say African Americans more specifically as opposed to minorities and women, because I think an awful lot of the time the statistics actually become distorted in an effort to present a picture that has become much better. And if you look at African Americans specifically, you can see the kind of distortion of statistics that has gone on. Lots of times minorities, Asians, and other minorities, Latinos are included, women, for example, are included to make it look like we've made vast achievements with regard to diversity, when in actuality not very much has been done at all in terms of African Americans. For so long, particularly when you look at the 1960s, and that's what I do because that's when I was coming along in terms of
Mm-hmm.
my development as a young man, we looked to the colors of green, black, and red as an indication of where our origin was, which was Africa. Malcolm X even insisted that African Americans appeal to the United Nations and align ourselves with African nations in order to get our civil rights, our human rights, not just civil rights, but our human rights in terms of American society. Of course, he was killed, so we don't know where he was going
Mm-hmm.
with that. Even Martin Luther King, I think they were trying to fathom what it all meant. But I've heard it said that America, because there's no guilt involved, has an easier time accepting an African than they do accepting an African.
Well, I've read. I mean.
Actually, unlike my aunt, I have memorized very little of it. I
Uh-huh.
can quickly tell you, I've gone to reunions with all of my aunts, and they tell me how when they were coming along at the historically black institutions, they had to memorize long, long passages of
Uh-huh.
Shakespeare and James Wendell Johnson and others. And that's not something that I do. I eased my way out of that little conflict by saying, well, you can recite those long passages, but I know what they mean.
Ah.
And God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. As far as the eye of God could see, darkness covered everything. Blacker than 100 midnights down in a cypress swamp. Then God smiled, and the light broke, and the darkness rolled up on one side, and the light stood shining on the other. And God said, that's good. Then God sat down on the side of a hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river he sat down. With his head in his hands, God thought and thought till he thought, I'll make me a man. Up from the bed of the river, God scooped the clay, and by the bank of the river he kneeled him down, and there the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the farmost corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hand, this great God, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down in the dust, toiling over a lump of clay, till he shaped it in his own image. Then into it he blew the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Amen, amen.
So does it have a meaning?
Does this have a meaning?
Yeah. What separates this from just the creation story in the Bible, say?
Well, it's not really, that's not the main aim, I don't think, to separate it from the creation story. This is
Okay.
a version of the creation story. But I like to believe that African American culture has a way of accenting something, even like the Bible, to make it much more, and I hate to say this about the Bible, but make it much more inviting in terms of the reception of the audience. And when it comes to African Americans particularly, and others, but African Americans, because that's my own culture, drama is such a vital element of it. So we don't even really understand the nature of the drama, but it's there. It's a way of surviving. It requires sometimes more than just reading.